Now, I've seen people make the argument that, truckers are mostly in their cabs, that the overwhelming majority, I think 90% of Canadian truckers are already vaccinated, that, all of the new reporting about Omicron suggests that the vaccines aren't as effective against it, although, of course, they protect the person who themselves is vaccinated. You had Dr. Fauci coming on TV and saying everyone's going to get Omicron eventually, and that this wasn't necessary, and that the truckers are actually protesting the fact that the vaccine passports themselves force them to slow down at the border and elongate their trips in a way that is disadvantageous. What do you make of that pushback?
Well, I mean, I think it's important to that we kind of distinguish between different aspects of this protest. I mean, I think the actual kind of purported connection to the trucking industry is, I think, at this point has more kind of symbolic importance to the protest than it does kind of numbers. I think the numbers, as you kind of just alluded to just now, a lot of these people are not actually truckers or even tied to the trucking industry itself. There's a much broader expression of kind of, it's a more ecumenical coalition than that. It's kind of a broad church.
So what is, and I'll go to you for this, Q, what is the motivation of that broader coalition then? What is driving it if it's beyond the concerns that are specifically germane to truckers?
The motivation of the broader coalition is to essentially tilt at the windmill one more time for an organization that tried in 2018 and 2019 to co-opt what could have been ostensibly a genuine workers' movement, or at least a protest against changing labor conditions, and eventually tailed off into an anti-immigrant and anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. So the important thing to note about the trucker protest is that it was organized by members of the People's Party of Canada, members of the Wexit Coalition, members of the Yellow Vest movement in Canada, which you have to differentiate from the Gilets Jaunes movement in France, because the Gilets Jaunes was more of a provincialist movement by suburban and rural workers that were protesting against labor conditions, against low pay, stagnant wages, income inequality, and so on. Whereas the Yellow Vest movement in Canada ostensibly began with protest against Canada's move towards decarbonization and towards sustainable energy, wind, solar, etc., which would have possibly meant less money and less subsidies for the oil, coal, and hydrocarbon sector. And what they were protesting against was the possibility that their jobs were going to become one day obsolete. But then what began to happen was that they were protesting against immigrants, refugees coming in through the Washington Road border crossing in Quebec. And the problem with that was that, the immigrants who were crossing through the Washington Road crossing were coming in through the United States. So there was a question of whether the United States and Canada should align with the Safe Third Countries paradigm, that if you are in the United States, you should apply for refugee status before coming into Canada. From the point of view of people that were coming in from Nigeria, Haiti, etc., they were saying that the United States was not a safe country to apply for refugee status. They would come to Canada instead, because if you applied for refugee status in the U.S., in all likelihood, you would be arrested by ICE, put up in a detention center, and then deported back to your home country. So the Yellow Vests were railing against people who believed that migrants coming in from Haiti and Nigeria should be able to apply for refugee status in Canada. And it went from railing against quote-unquote illegal immigrants to railing against immigration to Canada altogether. The problem in Canada is that unless we have about 350,000 people naturalized here on a year-to-year basis, we don't have the labor force productivity to sustain our country's needs. So it was a bit of cutting your nose off to spite your face. They were saying that we should take care of Canada first, but the problem is we simply don't have enough workers here in Canada to sustain our day-to-day needs. It went from there into railing against globalism, and then into some anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, which all culminated in the United We Roll convoy in 2019, which was an absolute bust. It was a bunch of, I guess, dead-enders and far-righters that ended up in Ottawa protesting against just this sort of like disparate set of ideas. There wasn't really like a concentrated set of ideas for them to coalesce around. And it just fizzled out amidst accusations of embezzlement, fraud, etc. That coalition fell apart. And then it began to reemerge under the auspices of anti-vaccine and anti-mandate protests, which is easy enough to understand as a genuine concern for the working class. That is, people who are, for example, losing their jobs as a result of not being able to get vaccinated and not being able to go to their jobs. Well, if you get fired from your job because you're not vaccinated, but then you're also kicked off of the unemployment rolls, that is a genuine concern for unions, like the Amalgamated Transit Union, for example, the union that takes care of bus drivers and train operators for the Toronto Transit Commission. Well, they had members that ended up getting kicked off of their job and then losing out on their unemployment, and they have been filing suits to make sure that those members can actually get unemployment insurance and to reinstate those members. So that's a genuine concern. But the problem is the people that are in Ottawa right now are not, for the most part, company drivers. 80% of truckers in Canada are company drivers. The other 20% are owner-operators. And for the most part, it's the owner-operators that are in Ottawa able to burn, diesel gas for, 3 weeks on end and not, use their trucks for the purpose of moving goods from one place to the other, but to use their trucks for the purpose of obstructing city streets. So the problem here is that they're speaking for the vast minority of truckers, and they're not bringing up other labor issues. Roughly about 40% of all labor violations in Canada emanate out of the trucking industry, but the trucking industry only accounts for about 17% of all employment in Canada. So there's just this outsized proportion of labor violations that are, for the most part, brought to bear by companies that underpay their employees, work them for long hours, and don't give them the proper sorts of labor protections. So you basically work your employees into exhaustion, and then you get rid of them and replace them as soon as they're no longer viable as workers. That's a huge problem for the trucking industry, but you don't see the truckers in Ottawa talking about that. What you hear them complaining about is the vaccine mandates and the passports, and also getting into this anti-immigrant stuff, getting into globalism, this, that, and the third, sort of going down the same road that their Yellow Vest forebears got into in 2019.
Ajamu, Q just referenced several legitimate concerns that could be raised but aren't being raised. And I've heard other interlocutors, including Professor Richard Wolff, make the argument that even if we are disdainful of and reject the, anti-immigrant, anti-Semitic, other kinds of bigoted statements that are associated with some people who are participating in the protest, that the left should be taking this opportunity to radicalize to the left people who are participating currently, and to kind of own the idea that this could be the kind of workers' movement that shuts down capital and has a kind of political effect that the left should, take part in more frequently. What do you make of that argument?
Well, we saw the response to our good friend to his, I think, very sensible kind of analysis and position. And the response reflected a kind of dangerous, simple approach to trying to understand what might be the content of some of these rebellions, if you will. There's no question that there are obvious right-wing forces involved in this truckers' convoy. There's no question that there is some agendas that are clearly in alignment with the agenda of the far right in the U.S. But to just dismiss these truckers as just representatives of the petty bourgeoisie because they are owner-operators, to suggest that there are not concerns that truckers have who are part of the working class that aren't being articulated when it seems like a few of those issues are. It does not lend itself to any kind of strategy on the part of left forces to be able to understand and, in fact, attempt to win some of those elements over if they were, in fact, winnable. Instead, what happens is that these forces are basically stigmatized and not thought about. There's no contest for these individuals. In fact, that's what's been happening for the last 3 decades. So basically, the only elements talking to these confused workers are, in fact, those rightist elements. And liberals and left liberal folks, they kind of talk down their nose at these people. And the result is Trumpism, the truckers' convoy, and all of these manifestations of the obvious right. But as I think most people know, I'm concerned about these elements, but I'm more concerned about the neoliberal right that's in power in most of these Western nations.
I want to get the other two's response to that. But first, Ben, can we play that clip with Professor Wolf where he's addressing this point that if the left doesn't get him, the right will?
But I want to say something, if you don't mind, about old Tucker Carlson.
Okay.
The history of Hitler, of Mussolini, is there's always a split on the right wing between those who just want to do the business of big business, the conservatives, the ones who think that the market is some genius institution and we should all bow down to it like some graven image, and those who know that if you only express the views of the employers, you're expressing the views of 1% of the people and you've lost everybody else. And they're not that stupid. So they've always had on the right wing, whether you call them fascists or not, those who want to appeal to the working class, who know that if they don't, they will be brushed aside. Hitler called his party the National Socialist Party. That was the point, to suggest to the German working class, which was overwhelmingly socialist in the 1930s when he got the power, that he was somehow their friend. Tucker Carlson wants to be somehow the friend of working people because somewhere he grasps that if you don't, you're just the mouthpiece of the Fox News people and who they congregate with. You won't go very far.
Yeah, so that was, Marxist economist who's been on the show a couple of times. Luke, what do you make of that argument? Do you think there's some risk that the left kind of taking a perhaps flat, a nuanced, antagonistic stance to the protest could lead to more fascism down the road?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, and I agree with what's been said so far. I mean, I think there's a very important, just basic taxonomical point that needs to be made in all this. I feel that there's been a tendency to talk about recent events and to kind of frame them in these purely monolithic terms. So people have this reflex where they want to say what the protests mean is X or what they mean is Y. And it's really important to stress that there are different forces at play here, which include the overtly right-wing kind of organizer class, petit bourgeois element, other things that have come up. But there's also, people that are just showing up for these demonstrations that are not part of the actual occupation. And, furthermore, and I think this is the group that is in some ways the more interesting one and is perhaps most germane to this conversation. There are people that aren't participating at all, have not been down to the occupation in Ottawa or anything like that, but are broadly supportive. And, there has been some interesting data out recently published by the Toronto Star. It's from Ecos Research. Toronto Star is the largest daily newspaper in Canada. This is data about not about the participants of the protest, but about where they are getting support, and what with the caveat, obviously, about the reliability of polling and things like that. What this research from Ecos suggests is that there is sympathy with the protests and their objectives from about a third of Canadians, so a significant minority. And if we examine this third a little more closely, we can see that there are polarities that I think are even more revealing. So there is a major generational divide. Half of Canadians under 50 appear to be sympathetic to these protests. There are also other factors at play, including education. So college graduates are more likely to be sympathetic. University graduates are more likely to be opposed. And I can say anecdotally, as somebody who grew up in rural Ontario and who now lives in a major city, that there's been a very profound difference between how my acquaintances and friends and circles from university have reacted to this versus people who I went to elementary school with, who are mostly not very political at all. And who, anecdotally anyway, they seem very keen to distance themselves from the overt far-right elements, but they're also, doing very earnest posts about how the media is not telling the truth about the story and it's exaggerating these elements. And what I take from those kind of responses is a much vaguer kind of anti-metropolitan, anti-federal government sentiment that isn't necessarily the kind of refined right-wing sentiment that we've seen elsewhere. One other point I want to make about this data that's been released is that one of the most interesting things that they found was that those most adamantly opposed to masks and mask mandates are by far people who have the bleakest economic outlook. So I certainly think that's relevant here as well.
Well, I want to pick up on that point about the perception that the media is misrepresenting who is involved. There was a lengthy investigative piece that I believe was published on Bari Weiss's Substack recently, where a journalist talked to about 100 of the protesters and did kind of like a photo gallery as well to try to demonstrate that there was much more diversity among the truckers and protesters than the media had represented. I've seen commentary about the fact that South Asians are overrepresented among the trucking population and are overrepresented in some respects in the protests as well. Q, what do you make of that?
I haven't seen the piece, so I can't really speak to that. As to the diversity of the protesters, I mean, I don't think anybody with any common sense is saying that all the protesters are white people or the protesters are white supremacists. There are like people on the sort of like the big L liberal side of things that are making the protesters out to be like wall-to-wall white supremacists, but I think that's both incredibly short-sighted and rather foolish just from an optics perspective. One of the big problems that they've had is that they've been trying to paint the protesters as being white supremacists, which would then make it okay for Trudeau to have passed the Emergency Act, or at least invoked the Emergency Act, which you can get into in a bit. And by positioning it as Trudeau fighting white supremacy by invoking the Emergency Act, then whatever measures are necessary to clear out the protesters are fine in the eyes of Canadians who do support that. But the big problem is almost immediately you can see where the backlash comes in, that the Emergency Act, as well as the repercussions thereof, where it comes to the financial industry and companies that are collecting money on behalf of other protests, may then begin to exercise some of their own discretion as to whether they're going to support those protests. So, for example, Indigenous land defense protests in Canada have already come under attack from GoFundMe, in the sense that GoFundMe is now freezing payments and refunding donations to the donors because they may find themselves once again under scrutiny by the Canadian government if they facilitate payments to Indigenous land defenders. That's already happened. And that's something that most people that were looking at it from a more nuanced point of view were saying, hey, hang on a second. If you are wholeheartedly supporting our government invoking the Emergency Act and bringing these financial institutions under the auspices of FinTrack, which is Canada's essentially like a national accounting agency, if you start doing that, then you create a chill among principal dissenters and protesters and those who support them. You create a chill where people are now unwilling to engage in protest because they may find themselves on the wrong side of the law. And then people who support them might find themselves disconnected from the Canadian banking system.
Yeah, so Justin Trudeau implementing this Emergency Act seemed to be a real turning point in the coverage I observed from left media, at least, where there was a flatter, more antagonistic kind of coverage that occurred until this really kind of aggressive infringement on speech that the left very quickly anticipated could disproportionately affect them, as it often does, came into play. Ajamu Baraka, you tweeted, neoliberals are exposing themselves as most effective agents of fascism. The Emergency Act in Canada, evoked in opposition to the truckers' action, can, quote, temporarily suspend parts of Canadian constitution that protect free movement and assembly. What do you make of all of this?
Neoliberal fascism. That for me, the major threat to democracy is not coming from the still disorganized and clownish far right, so-called far right, but the neoliberal rightists who control the state, and they have been involved working very closely with the extended ideological apparatus of the state, private corporations, media corporations, to systematically narrow the approved areas of discourse in the U.S., in Canada, without much opposition at all. It's one of the most dangerous developments, in my opinion, since the Second World War. So no, I'm more concerned about these kinds of moves. justice. I mean, the emergency act in Canada, the censorship we see from the big tech corporations in the U.S. All of these are part of a pattern of conditioning the public with the support of left forces, also unfortunately, to accept Big Brotherism. It's Orwellian, and I don't understand why more people don't recognize this. And they always use the right as the entry point to begin to provide more power to the state.
Yeah, I want to be really, I don't want to gloss over what's at stake here. Can one of you really dig in and help us to understand what the implications of the Emergency Act are and how far-reaching it can be, and what the real potential is there to quell protest action?
Well, one immediate response that I can mention is that Indigenous land defense funds that are collected for the purpose of supporting Indigenous land defense then immediately come under financial scrutiny. But then another issue that I saw was that a measure that was proposed, which, assuming that the act is going to be approved by Parliament, which I'm fairly sure that it will, is that if you bring your children to the protest, then you can face jail time. So you're looking at $5,000 or a 5-year jail term. And one of the biggest problems in Canada has been, for the last couple of decades, the ease with which children's aid services are able to take children away from their parents and put them into a system and make it very difficult to get them back. Now, here's the thing. For Indigenous people that have been dealing with this for a long time, it doesn't really get a lot of attention until it happens to white people in Canada. But it can be as easy as a couple in British Columbia that gave birth to their first child, and within 9 minutes of that child being born, the child is taken away by Children's Aid. Why? Not because of anything that the couple actually did, but because a nurse suspected that the mother might neglect the child. And they've been fighting to get that child back ever since. It's been
On the basis
years
of
now.
what?
There was no basis. It was because the nurse was suspicious that the mother might neglect the child. That was it.
Okay, so
This
Minority
happens all the
Report
time.
stuff.
Yeah. So this is something that Indigenous communities in Canada have been dealing with for a very long time. And no matter how loud the alarms get raised, no matter how many feature stories that there are in front pages of publications, nothing actually changes. So what we've done now is make it even easier for governments to, if, for example, there's a land defense protest or there's a protest for Black lives or anything of that nature that takes place in Canada, and the police happen to see that there are children present, that they will write down the name of the person that has brought the child to the protest, or if that person is arrested, then the children end up in the Children's Aid Services system, and it's incredibly difficult and incredibly expensive to get them back.
Luke, has the Emergency Act had an effect on public sympathy for the protesters?
I think it's probably a little bit too soon to tell. I do think from the polling I've seen, the invocation of the Emergencies Act has majority support. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt about that. And I think it maps fairly clearly onto the fact that a strong majority is not in sympathy with the protest, is not, supportive of them. But I want to add just kind of further to everything that's just been said. There's an emerging response from kind of right-leaning liberals around this that I think very much vindicates what the kind of left civil libertarian argument has been throughout this, the past few days in this debate over the Emergencies Act. Just yesterday, David Frum, who I assume needs no introduction, tweeted, Canadian governments need to communicate. No more blockades, no more industrial sabotage, not of pipelines, not of railways, not of highways, not of bridges, not of city downtowns. There's a plaza in front of your city hall for a reason. Got to protest, bring your placards there. I've seen other versions of this in some places too. I actually saw Justin Trudeau's former principal secretary, who I think now works at the Eurasia Group, basically making the argument that, regardless of the political character of protests, if they become disruptive to people's lives, there's a balancing act that needs to happen, and the police have an obligation to end those protests and the disruption. So it's absolutely the case that we're seeing what's going on right now potentially being spun into kind of wider crackdown on protests in general, regardless of their political character. It goes without saying on this show, but the most constructive political activities you can imagine are all incredibly disruptive, whether we're talking about strikes, indigenous land blockades, or whatever. So I think that the debate over the Emergencies Act has really brought that to the fore. And I also, I'm not an expert about this legislation, but I'm not at all convinced. I mean, the biggest question to me here seems to be why existing law was not adequate to clear up this disruption in Ottawa. It's not clear to me at all that that's the case, and I'm not convinced about the arguments that have been made for the Emergencies Act at all for that reason.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm certainly not the first to point out that there do seem to be these kind of glaring parallels between the language that was used by conservatives in reference to the 2020 George Floyd protests and some of the language that's been used around the truckers coming from more left political spheres. So, a real frustration with the idea of blocking my way to work and being in the streets and how this is a problem and we have to protect and defend industry, which we thought was ridiculous when we're comparing whether or not, your Bank of America teller can get into the store one day versus protesting the on-camera murder of a human being, in the George Floyd protest context. But now the same, well, I don't mean literally the same actors, but the same kind of political cohort, it seems. The liberal media cohort is talking about slashing tires and emptying out gas tanks and pulling trucks away and seemingly are indifferent to some of the civil libertarian consequences of all of this. Ajamu, as someone who is an organizer and has been involved in protest movements, I wonder if you ever wish you saw more of this kind of disruptive activity happening on the left, especially now 2 years out. Coming up on 2 years out from the start of the George Floyd protests, where the largest number of people in the streets didn't turn into anything material in terms of improving the lives of Black Americans or others who are victimized by the police state.
Exactly. As the Biden administration basically turned its back on all of the promises it made to address the plight of the working class and the temporary relief that folks had in terms of protection against evictions, of employment. As those programs began to run out, where was the left opposition? Where were the organizations aligned with the Democrats who came out in incredible numbers in the first year or so of the Trump administration? They didn't come out because they were basically told or they understood that opposition to the Biden administration was forbidden if you wanted to keep on getting your money. Okay, so this is the hypocrisy that we have to deal with the so-called left in the United States and in Canada. To hear these people try to make this left-right kind of dichotomy, but yet they are so unclear about their opposition to rightist forces when it comes to situations like Ukraine. How do you justify supporting neo-fascists in Ukraine and you are supposed to be against the right? So this is the mass confusion we see in the Western world, the confusion around what is in fact white supremacy. And it is the consequence of this is that left forces that should be with some of these militant expressions of opposition, they find themselves on the sideline or in support of the neoliberal right.
Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.